All right. You can go ahead and turn your Bibles to the book of Ezra, chapter 5. Ezra chapter 5. We'll get there eventually. But I have quite a few things I would like to mention, I guess in way of review before we get there, because I was telling Larson I feel like we're going to move through tonight's lesson fairly quickly. So I think we have a little bit of time to kind of soak in what we've already been talking about a little bit. I don't know how many Auburn fans I have in here, fellow Auburn fans. I know I've got a couple. I know my Ezel family joined in with me there, but I would like to apologize to y'all for what I'm about to say. But one of the people that I go to a lot to listen to, I guess about leadership and how to lead, especially right here before the school year, before we start to go into the classroom and everything. I listen to Coach Saban a lot of his lessons on leadership and a lot of his ideas about that, because he has some pretty good views on how to lead people. And one of the things that I have drawn from him, or one of the things I remember him talking about, was the definition of discipline and what discipline is. And I think I might have shared that before in an invitation here. I can't remember. But he says something to the extent of discipline is doing what you're supposed to do, when you're supposed to do it, the way that it's supposed to be done, every time. And that might be paraphrasing a little bit, but that's his view on discipline. And I feel like as we get into tonight's lesson on Ezra, and as we reflect back on what the children of Israel have been through so far, I feel like that's one of the applications that we can make. I feel like that we can kind of look at their journey here, and we can say, okay, if we're disciplined, this is the type of life we're gonna live. If we don't have discipline, then this is the type of life that we're going to live. So I remember when I was younger, there was a saying, where there's a will, there's a way. And I think that is very applicable in tonight's lesson, because if you look back at the children of Israel, I hate when this happens. Thought just went totally away. But where there's a will, there's a way. When we're doing what hold on just a second. Never try to teach without your notes. All right, so what we see from tonight's lesson is this. When we know that there is something that we have to do, something that we have been instructed to do, but we don't really want to do it, what do we do a lot of times? What do we look for? We look for excuses. We look for every reason in the world that we can find not to do it, right? I know if I have the choice to go fishing or cut the grass, knowing that my grass has to be cut, a lot of times I'm going to choose to go fishing, because that's what I want to do. That's what I have the will or the want to do. And I look for every excuse I can look for to get out of mowing the grass. But on the flip side of that, when we know that something needs to be done and we really want to, really want to, then we're going to find a way. We're going to find a way to do that when it's something that we really want to do. And I think when we look at tonight's lesson, that is what we see in the children of Israel. When God has instructed us to do something, and it is His will that it's done, and we have the zeal and the will to do it, then God is going to provide us a way to do that. Okay? So if we look back at when we opened the book of Ezra a while back, before we talked about Haggai and Zechariah, when we look back at the start of the book of Ezra, what was the setting? Who was king in Persia when we opened the book of Ezra? Cyrus. That is very important for tonight's lesson. Cyrus was in control in Persia. It was his first year to reign when we opened the book of Ezra. And what did God lead him to do? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Okay. Yes, he led him to send the people back, allow the people that desire to go back and to rebuild the temple of God in Jerusalem. And those that did went back, and what did they find? They found the city in ruins, right? They found their homes left desolate. They found their homes left in ruins. Now, what would be the natural thing for those people to want to do? When they go back and they see their land, they see their homes left desolate, what would be the natural thing that they would want to do? Yeah, they would want to rebuild their homes. That's right. You know, and we're the same way. You know, if we go on vacation and we're gone for a period of time, and we come back and say it's came a big windstorm or something, and there's limbs all in the yard, a lot of times we can't wait to get those picked up because we don't want our yard looking like that, right? So the very first chance we get, we're going to get that cleaned up. So that's kind of where they are. But what were they instructed to do? They were instructed to rebuild the temple. Okay? So when they first came back, did they have zeal? Did they have will, the want to, when they first came back? Yes, they did. And we know that because what was the very first thing they did in the fall of the year when they came back to Jerusalem? They built an altar to offer sacrifices to God on, right? But then that winter passed, and in the spring, here we go again. We're ready to build the temple. This is what we've been instructed to do. Let's get to work. Zerubbabel and Jeshua led the way, and the foundation of the temple was laid. But then something happened. A bump in the road, right? A group of people came to them that were not exactly following God. They had some pagan worship mixed in there, and they wanted to help. No, you're not going to help. But then that group of people did what? They wrote a letter to the king. They said, look, Cyrus, or I'm sorry, we're in the days of Darius now, my fault. Wrote a letter to Darius and explained to him, look, this is what the children of Israel are trying to do. They're trying to rebuild this temple so that they can overtake you, so that they can disobey you. Okay? And what happened as a result of that? Work on the temple came to a stop, right? So up until this point, everything was good. They had the will to do what God said. Now, I hope I haven't butchered this up so much that we're going to lose the point of all of this. But they had the will to work until this decree to stop working on the temple came from the king. Then they went back home, and they became distracted by the work on their own homes, on their own fields, getting their own work done. And the work that God sent them back home to do was abandoned. And you know, I'm going to mention one more thing, and I'm going to open this up for y'all or for Larson to comment on. But I think that can happen a lot of times to us, a lot of times to Christians. You know, when we're on fire for God, we feel like that there's nothing that's going to stop us in a way. You know, we feel like that we want to be at every service. We want to teach every person that we come in contact with the good news, and we're zealous to do God's work. But if you ever leave that, if you ever let that go to the back burner and get in the back of your mind and let other things become more important, a lot of times, more time than we want to passes before we realize that, doesn't it? And we're like, whoa, here I have not been doing what I'm supposed to do, and I need to get back on track. Well, that's kind of where the children of Israel stand at this point in time before we get into chapter 5.
Yeah. So it helps me. I should have had my timeline up, but just helps me with dates. So the year that Cyrus gives the order where they can go back, anybody know about the date of that? 536 is what I normally say, about 536. The reason I think that's important, 606 is about when the first captives were taken, right? So that's Daniel and his company, about 606, 605. Cyrus gives the order about 536. That's important because that's 70 years, right? So the 70 years of captivity lines up pretty well. Artaxerxes is the king that says, they write the letter to that says you can't write. And the reason I say that is because Darius is going to figure into this chapter quite a bit. So the ceasing will go from about 536 until about the year 520. The year 520 is, I think, the second year of King Darius. So that takes us to the end of 4. So that takes us right into the beginning of chapter 5. Now, and you may have been going to review these, but in chapter 5 and verse 1, we kind of get a good summary of probably the last 3 or 4 of our classes with these prophets that are named. Who are the 2 prophets that are named in 5 verse 1? Haggai and Zechariah. So they're going to show up at about that second year of Darius that we read about at the very end of chapter 4. So I don't want to tread over.
No, anything. You're good.
But I just wanted to kind of bring all that together. So that takes us to about the year 520, which helps us kind of get a timeline, a chronology of all this. And so, you know, we can talk more about that in just a second if you want.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, 536-ish to 520-ish. So 15, 16 years, I think that's right.
Since they've stopped.
That's right, since they stopped.
All right, so.
And there was a will in me to help you with the point you were trying to make, but there was no way because I didn't.
Well,
I didn't know. But I appreciate the point very much. Yeah.
Sometimes I'm so bad I'm helpless.
Well, that introductory, it was a great introduction. I wanted to help you, and I was like, I don't know what to say now.
All right. So,
well, can I just think for just a second about Haggai and Zechariah, just kind of an overview? To me, it seems like Haggai is straight to the point. I read one commentator said that he was sure to dot every I. I think we know exactly what Haggai was trying to say, which was get back to work, right? So when we read, so you talk about rebuilding their own houses, they had done that. And just like Mr. Colby said, they had gotten distracted. And Haggai comes to them and says, what are you waiting on, right? You've spent all your time in that, and all that's going to be taken away unless you get back to the real work that matters. Zechariah is not quite as clear in what he is communicating, right? He's a very... well, I wouldn't say crazy writer. It's not crazy. It's just the visualizations that he has are really intense and somewhat mysterious. And we're not really given all the details about how to fill in all those gaps. But I think what he is doing is saying ultimately that God's enemies are going to be defeated and his people are going to triumph. And if all they get to do in that is be a part of rebuilding the temple, then don't despise that you get to be a part of this process. And I think that's kind of Zechariah's overall picture, is that God's going to take care of his people. He's going to make sure his things get done. That's not going to mean that it's always going to look exactly the same, that his people are going to look exactly the same as they do then. It's going to end up including all nations, and it's going to be a much bigger thing. But he is going to take care of his people, and he is going to defend them from his enemies. But it's a lot more of a mysterious, challenging picture when we look at Zechariah. So Haggai's what, 2 chapters? Gets right at the point. Zechariah's 14 chapters, and we kind of wander through the point. But ultimately, I think both of them are trying to give the same encouragement to get to God's work, because he ultimately has control over all of this.
And when you talk about that, obviously, as we look at this tonight, Haggai and Zechariah, their message from God changed the mindset of the people. We're going to see that. And I wonder, talking about Zechariah, if maybe a part of that was, if you remember, there were some of the people, when they looked at the foundation of the temple that was laid, and they thought back to the old temple of Solomon's, what was their thoughts and their feelings? Yeah, they were sad in a way. It says they wept. So I wonder if there might have been some discouragement there of, no matter what we do here, it's not going to be as grand and as extravagant as what we had before. But so I think Zechariah's message of, it might not be, but what God is preparing for you is something that's going to be much better than any physical temple could ever be. Talking about Jesus, that's going to be so much better. I think that might have boosted maybe the morale of the people. Something there changed the mindset and got the people back to work. And we're going to see that tonight. So
they're going to face similar challenges again, and it's not going to stop them this time, because they're going to be so.
Yes, exactly.
And when they're committed, God's committed to working with and through them. When they weren't committed in the previous chapters, he didn't keep the outlawing of it from happening. Mm-hmm. But we're going to notice what he does here. I love this in verse 1, and I know y'all probably went over this, but in the name of God of Israel, who was over them. I think you can mean that in 2 senses in Ezra 5:1. He was over them, as in he was in charge. They were accountable to him, but he was over them in that he was watching out for them. He was taking care of them. And in both of those ways that God was over them, I think that's going to kind of shape chapters 5 and 6, is that God is over them, and we get to see how that's the case. But I think that's right connected with the end of chapter 4. The work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So we're looking to something going to be changing here. And so what changes is exactly what Mr. Colby said. Now we got the work of Haggai and Zechariah. So this is a turning point in this period of time. This kind of first phase of the return is about to see its own change in situation.
If you look with me there in verse 2, it says, so Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, rose up and began to build the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, helping them. So there you go. The message that they received from Haggai and Zechariah got them back on their feet, and now we're moving. Okay? Verse 3. At the same time, Tatnai, the governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar Boaz and their companions came to them and spoke thus to them. Who has commanded you to build this temple and finish this wall? So let me kind of stop there and talk about who that is, okay? So under this Persian Empire, what Darius wanted to do is it was his desire that he governed this region well. He wanted to govern it in a way that was even stronger than Cyrus did. And he was very good at what he did. So the way he did it is he divided his land up. He divided the empire up into 20 different areas called satraps. And over each one of those areas, he placed like a governor over the people of that area. And then it kind of trickled down. That area was also divided into even more leaders. But the governor that would have been the governor of this satrap, who would have had to answer to Darius, was Tatnai. He was over the province or the area that Judah would have been in. Okay, so that is why he comes and he asks this question: who has commanded you to build this temple and finish this wall? He had every right to ask that question because this was his land to govern. Okay, now he was not part of the people who stopped the work originally. All right, he as a matter of fact, it doesn't seem here that he's going to be a person that really wants to stop it this time. Okay, and we'll see that as we go on through here. So verse 4. Then accordingly we told them the names of the men who were constructing this building, but the eye of their God was upon the elders of the Jews, so that they could not make them cease till a report could go to Darius. Then a written answer was returned concerning this matter. So when Tatnai comes and he questions them, who instructed you to do this, and give me the names of the people that are doing it, he did not stop work on the temple like happened before, okay? He is going to allow this work to go on until what? Yes, until he gets a letter one way or another. That's a good way to put it. Either saying, let them continue or let them stop, one or the other. He's going to let them continue. But I think looking there in verse 5, that's not just, we can't lay that all on the governor here. Who really made that happen? God did. That's God working through him and God taking care of his people, like Larson mentioned a while ago. So they're going to continue work until they hear back from Darius.
And this could have been a moment where the Jewish people acted out of fear and stopped. Like, oh, here we go again. They could have said, this is all going to get shut down anyway. But it doesn't look like they stopped. And then maybe that's part of God's favor towards them, is that he sees that this is a committed group. And so he's going to be with them in a special way here.
Yes. And that's kind of where I was going with my introduction there, because I was wanting to compare people when there's a will to work there, when there's a will to get something done, versus when there's a will not to and a will to go do something else. This is where we see this. The first time this happened, they didn't have the will to finish the temple. They didn't have the will to continue work. They looked for that reason to stop. But here, this time, that's not going to happen. They're going to continue working because they want to get it done. Okay? All right. Any questions or comments before we get into the letter?
Christians are involved in the work. And let's say the government says, y'all don't have to stop. It's happened in this country. You know, so you just lay down. It's happened.
Yeah.
It's happened.
Yeah. And when I talk about making application to us, it's exactly what I'm talking about. That's exactly right. If you're God's people, you can't lay down and stop.
Like you said, no will.
Yeah.
Make a way.
And you know, as I was preparing for this, the thought came to my mind too along those lines, Timmy. As I was thinking about this New Jerusalem that was promised, and as I was thinking about what Darius does in this situation, he just gives them the go ahead to go ahead and finish this temple. It doesn't always work like that, does it? Here on earth. I mean, just because we're doing God's will doesn't mean that everything is going to go just like we want it to here. But if you're doing God's will, just like the New Jerusalem Zechariah was prophesying about, the ultimate reward, we've got that to look forward to, even if Darius hadn't have let them continue work on the temple. You see what I'm saying? Anything else? All right. Let's look at the letter that was written, starting in verse 6. This is the letter that Tatnai the governor sent to Darius. It says, the governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-Boznai and his companions, the Persians who were in the region beyond the river, that's talking about the Euphrates, by the way, to Darius the king. They sent a letter to him in which was written thus, to Darius the king, all peace. Let it be known to the king that we went into the province of Judea to the temple of the great God, which is being built with heavy stones, and timber is being laid in the walls. And this work goes on diligently and prospers in their hands. Then when we asked those elders and spoke thus to them, who commanded you to build this temple and to finish these walls? We also asked them their names to inform you that we might write the names of the men who were chief among them. And thus they returned us an answer, saying, we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and completed. Let me stop right there for a minute, going just because Timmy raised that thought. If you think about that right there, their answer to their governor here, when he asked who they were under, who gave them this command, what was their answer there? They were servants of God. Do we have that kind of faith? As Timmy was saying, if our government came to us and said, you're going to have to stop, who commands you to do this? Do we have that type of faith that we could look someone in the eye and say, we are servants of God? I think that's a pretty powerful verse there. Verse 12, but because our fathers provoked the God of heaven to wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this temple and carried the people away to Babylon. However, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to build this house of God. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple that was in Jerusalem and carried into the temple of Babylon, those King Cyrus took from the temple of Babylon and were given to one named Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. So he said to him, take these articles, go, carry them to the temple site that is in Jerusalem, and let the house of God be rebuilt on its former site. Then the same Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem, but from that time even until now it has been under construction, and it is not finished. And then verse 17 to finish the chapter says, now therefore, if it seems good to the king, let a search be made in the king's treasure house, which is there in Babylon, whether it is so that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to build this house of God at Jerusalem, and let the king send us his pleasure concerning this matter. Now, if you think back to the first time this situation came about, could it have been handled differently? Yes. Do you think that the result might have been different 16 years earlier had their response been like this response was? It very well could have been. It's very possible. But they did not do that. They didn't search for that. They didn't search for an answer. But here, after their story is told to Darius here, there's a request for him to go to the records and see what he can find, if there's anything he can find on such a decree from Cyrus, that would have allowed these people to do this. Okay? So in verse, we'll go ahead and that'll lead us into chapter 6. Verse 1 says, King Darius issued a decree, and a search was made in the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon, and at Ecmetha, in the palace that is in the province of Media, a scroll was found, and in it a record was written thus. Verse 3.
Before we get to that letter,
All right,
can I ask you a
yes.
question? Did anybody come across anything with regard to Sheshbazzar, that is the governor, back up in verses 14 and 15 and 16, that's mentioned as the one laying the foundation of the temple? Yeah, I think the best way to read that, at least in my opinion, I've read some other things. I think the best way to read that is that is the Babylonian or the Persian name for Zerubbabel. Just like Daniel has his name changed, I think that's probably what we're talking about. It is possible that there is a foreign governor that's put in place over Zerubbabel, and so that he's allowing it. But we don't read anything else about this guy. Zerubbabel is mentioned at the beginning of the chapter because I think that's the name we would know him by. But when they send to ask for a search in the royal archives, I think they would be looking for something under Sheshbazzar, which is the same as Zerubbabel. So I think that's probably the case. It is possible that we're talking about a different person, but the fact that they line up so well and that we know Zerubbabel was responsible for the laying of the foundation and being the governor there, I think it makes the best case that that's who he is. Could be wrong about that. I don't know that there's any way to come to 100% certainty on that, but I think that's definitely the way I'm leaning. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I think that's right. We talked about that a little bit the night that you weren't here.
Oh, okay.
But that is a great point that when they go to look this up, that was the name that they would
Probably
use.
under, if you're looking in the index in Babylon, it's going to be under that. So that's right.
Yeah. Anything else before we get into what the record said? All right.
Just notice in verse 2 that it's not in the documents in Babylon. It's going to be in this place. What did you say? Ecbatana or
Ecmetha.
Yeah. The English Standard renders that a little bit differently, but evidently this is a place where Cyrus had his headquarters, not prior to taking over Babylon, but early on in his time. Because he was the kings of the Medes and Persians that take over, and this was another place where he had taken his seat of power. So all the records weren't in the city of Babylon. So they don't just stop looking when they can't find it in Babylon. They're even looking into this place in Media to find the record there. So they're doing a pretty diligent search to verify if this is it. And it may have been because they knew that Cyrus had written decrees like this. And so they want to make sure that they can verify it for the people of Israel, or Judah specifically. All right, I won't interrupt that.
That's good. Okay, here's what the record said in verse 3, the record they found. In the first year of King Cyrus issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where they offered sacrifices, and let the foundations of it be firmly laid. Its height 60 cubits, and its width 60 cubits, with 3 rows of heavy stones and 1 row of new timber. Let the expenses be paid from the king's treasury, and also let the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took from the temple which is in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and taken back to the temple which is in Jerusalem, each to its place, and deposit them in the house of God. So there it is. The record says exactly what the account that the children of Israel gave to Tatnai. It says it exactly. So, verse 6, therefore Tatnai, governor of the region beyond the river, and your companions, the Persians who are beyond the river, keep yourselves far from there. Let the work of this house of God alone, and let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God on its site. So that was Darius's order to Tatnai, who was directly under him. Leave the people alone and let them get this work done. Okay? But he didn't stop there. In verse 8, he says, moreover, I issue a decree as to what you shall do for the elders of these Jews for the building of this house of God. Let the cost be paid at the king's expense from taxes on the region beyond the river. This is to be given immediately to these men so that they are not hindered. And whatever they need, young bulls, rams, and lambs for the burnt offerings of the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, and oil, according to the request of the priests who are in Jerusalem, let it be given them day by day without fail. So, here's Darius's order. Not only are you to leave them alone and let them work, but you're also, the taxes from the people of your region, the people of your province, are going to be used to help support the building of this temple. And not only that, but we're also going to get you to provide for them the necessary animals to make sacrifices to God there. That was from Darius to Tatnai. In verse 11, I issue a decree that whoever alters this edict, let a timber be pulled from his house and erected, and let him be hanged on it, and let his house be made a refuse heap, or basically a garbage dump, because of this. And may the God who causes his name to dwell there destroy any king or people who put their hand to alter it, or to destroy this house of God which is in Jerusalem. I, Darius, issue a decree, let it be done diligently. So Darius is very serious, it seems like, about letting this work continue so that the house of God can be rebuilt. Any questions or comments or anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. One, so the previous time where the enemies come, the response is like the exact opposite of this, right? But in this case, not only do you have it's okay, but keep everybody away from it, right? Keep everybody from interfering with this. The cost, you need to make sure it's paid for. You need to make sure all the supplies are given to them for the offerings and the sacrifices. So what looked like a very bad situation a second time, right? The investigation into it actually ends up working in their favor, right? One, it doesn't slow down the work at all. They're able to keep working. And second, then you get an assurance that it's going to be paid for. The supplies are going to be given. Everybody's going to be kept away from the work. And it goes in beyond that. It's not just the royals aren't going to mess with it. If anybody else tries to mess with it, their house is going to be taken down, right? You mess with the house of the Lord and your house gets messed up. That's a pretty, I guess, a just way of going about things, right? Now, why is Darius interested in doing this? He wants God's favor. Now, I think he probably has a very pagan approach to this. I don't think he's approaching this like, oh, that's the only God on the planet. Or over the planet. I don't think that's what he's thinking. I think he's probably thinking, I want people everywhere to worship and honor their gods in a way that if there's anybody out there that'll give favor, they'll give it to me. And that's not a perfect way of approaching it, but it's a way that works in the favor of the people of Judah at this moment. Because notice in verse 10, he says that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. He wants to show them favor so that not only will God show him favor, but the people will show him favor, that they will pray on his behalf. I think that's really interesting here, how God is obviously he's used Cyrus and he used Darius, both who were pagan kings who kind of gave this right to lots of people. He's giving them this right in a special way. So it's really interesting to me. All right. So the initial investigation actually works out to their greater good in the greater scheme of things. He does, yeah. Yeah, I wonder, it must have been that maybe in the record, maybe there was more of a record of the kinds of things that they would need, or maybe in the letter there's more requests for the specifics, but it is interesting that he's able to mention the animals and the things that they're going to need for sacrifices.
I wonder if because this is the God of heaven, so I don't know, you were saying that maybe they still worship other gods, but I wonder if he viewed him as a superior God.
Yeah.
You know, they had levels of gods. So.
Maybe. It seems to be that's the way they reference him. This is in verse 11, back up in chapter 5. We are servants of the God of heaven and earth. So maybe he's picking up on that language. But I think there was, what's the name of the god? Like Ahura Mazda or something was a Persian god, and he described himself as the God of the heavens or the God of heaven. So he may have just been using language that was familiar to him, even though he doesn't mean it, it actually applies to the God of Judah in a way better than it Certainly better than the way it did to the god Mazda that he had. But anyway.
Okay, so if you look in verse 15, it says the temple was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, which was in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. So I think I read where that month of Adar would have been the last month of their calendar. Okay, so and that's going to be important leading up into the finishing this chapter up. So the temple was finished in that last month of Adar. They dedicated it and celebrated it. And then look in verse 19. It says the descendants of the captivity kept the Passover, because that would have been the next month, right? That would have been the 14th day of the first month. So when it came time, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the first month, for the priests and the Levites had purified themselves. All of them were ritually cleaned, and they slaughtered the Passover lambs for all the descendants of the captivity, for their brethren, the priests, and for themselves. But then look in 21. It says the children of Israel who had returned from the captivity ate together with all who had separated themselves from the filth of the nations of the land in order to seek the Lord God of Israel. Who would that be talking about? Proselytes? Yes. It would it have been Jews? Would it have been people of the lineage of the children of Israel? No. But do you remember when those people came to ask to help build the temple and they wouldn't allow them to? Why would they not allow them to? Yes, but what was their worship like? Was their worship pure? Were their hearts pure? No, they weren't. But do you see where I'm going with this? In order to be right in God's sight, in order to be part of God's people, is it because you're a part of a certain bloodline? Is it because your last name is of a certain family? No. What does it all have to do with? Whether your heart is pure and obedient to God, right? So if you think about that, do they have reason now to accept these people into their worship? Yes, because what had those people done? They had separated themselves from the filth of the nations of the land to seek the Lord God of Israel. And that's what we should all be trying to do, right? Because that's what you have to do to be right in God's sight. And then verse 22, they kept the feast of unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord made them joyful and turned the heart of the king of Assyria toward them to strengthen their hands in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. You have any closing comments on that?
Yeah, I love that line at the very end. He made them joyful and turned the heart of the king of Assyria. Now, it's interesting that it mentions Assyria because the Assyrian empire is gone, but I think he's just using that phrase like this has kind of brought us full circle, right? We've got Assyria is the one that comes away and takes away the northern tribes, but now he references him as the king of Assyria. They would have called that region where he was ruling over, they still would have referred to it as something like Assyria, but the fact that now the king of Assyria's heart turned toward them so that he, talking about Darius, aids them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. It's really a powerful statement of the full circle that we've come to. You want to notice this up in verse 17? They offered at the dedication of this house 100 bulls, 200 rams, and 400 lambs. If you look at Solomon's dedication, I think it's like 10,000 and 20,000 of each. I mean, it's just huge numbers. This is a significant offering, but it does kind of pale in comparison to what Solomon's temple offering was. So you can read about that in 1 Kings 8, verse 63. But one thing that I'm interested in is that they offer a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. They're coming back. This is really basically just the nation of Judah. Remember, those other 10 tribes were taken by Assyria, and they're gone, right? They don't have a return from captivity that we read about. But when the people come back to Jerusalem and Judah, when they offer this animal sacrifice, they offer for all 12 tribes. It seems to me that they're saying, we understand that all of God's people is still under consideration in some way. Now, I say that it's not as if there were never any other people from other tribes referenced. They were. You remember Anna in the New Testament that was there at the praying at the temple? I believe it tells us that she was from the tribe of Asher, right? So even though there's not a big return from captivity for them, that doesn't mean they completely cease to exist. And the people of Judah know that. And they don't say, ha, we get to come back and you didn't. No, what do? They offer a sin offering, which is, in the first place, it's a recognition of their failure, right? You only offer a sin offering when you think you failed. But it's also an evidence that they still trust God, that they're willing to offer a sacrifice in order to find the atonement that comes. So that's kind of a beautiful picture. So this rebuilding of the temple kind of ends that first phase of the return from rebuilding. Now, we're going to have really two more major phases. We're going to have an Ezra-led rebuilding phase. And we're going to have a Nehemiah-led rebuilding phase. But this, in the year 516 BC, kind of ends that first phase with the rebuilding of the temple led by Zerubbabel and Jeshua, and then Haggai and Zechariah being our major prophets of the time. But we're going to go back to captivity for a bit. We're going to look at Esther in captivity for a while. When we come back, we'll be like 50 years down the line, or maybe more when Ezra finally comes back. So we've looked at that first chunk of time from about 536 at the beginning of the return all the way to 516 with the rebuilding of the temple. And then we'll kind of, when we come to chapter 7, we turn the page, but we turn about 60 years at the same time. So it's kind of amazing.
So for next time, as we're going to take another break from Ezra right here. As we follow this chronologically, we're going to see that the story of Esther is going to fall right here. So for next time, if you want to go ahead and read ahead, you can read Esther 1 through 4 for Wednesday night.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.